Hello, welcome to Through Lucy's Lens, weekly videos where I go somewhere interesting and hopefully you will find them interesting too. I'm a social historian and your serially nosy friend. So where am I today? Well, this is the second time I've done this introduction because this location was going to be just an add-on because I thought probably not going to be much here, but now I'm here it's going to be a full video because it is amazing and it is a weirman's cottage here on the Norfolk Broads. It's so beautiful. The cottage itself is, it's just an idyllic chocolate box cottage. The sort that we think of when we think about cottages here in England, particularly I imagine if you're watching from overseas. But obviously there's a really fascinating story to tell as well. So let's go and have a look at Toad Hole Cottage. Even the name is incredible. Let's go. Today we are going to take a walk around the tiny Toad Hole Cottage. Found in How Hill on the Norfolk Broads. It's not particularly well known and most people just come across it when arriving to take a boat trip. It shows a way of life that shaped this part of the country for generations and has been turned into a tiny museum managed by the Broads Authority. And most magnificently, it's absolutely free to visit. Toad Hole Cottage was once home to a Marshman and his family, and it was built around 1740. A marshman was a working man whose job was to maintain the drainage dikes, manage the reed beds, and help keep the land usable in the low-lying landscape of the Norfolk Broads. The Norfolk Broads are not naturally occurring. They're flooded medieval peat diggings, and without constant maintenance, they'd quickly become overgrown and unmanageable. The work the marshman did here was physical and relentless. He would be cutting the reeds, clearing waterways, and watching over the pumps. All the time contending with water, weather, and isolation. I think this job must have been most brutal over the winter. Toad Hole Cottage itself is tiny, just 2 small rooms upstairs and 1 downstairs, with a later lean-to kitchen added on. The marshman would have lived here with his entire family, who would have also become involved in the work on the Broads. Life here was lived close together and with very few of the comforts we take for granted today. Inside the cottage, it's been beautifully recreated to reflect how it might have looked in the 19th century, during the Victorian period when it was occupied by a marshman and his family. The furniture is plain and mostly homemade or handed down. There's a gorgeous range for cooking and heating in the downstairs living space. There's a few basic shelves and not really much else. You'll find reed mats lining the ceiling, and this is a cheap and effective form of insulation. And outside, the same reed would have been harvested for thatching the roof of the cottage. There was no running water inside the cottage, no electricity and no proper sanitation. If the children who lived here went to school, they would have walked miles to get there. Illness was common and the marshes could be dangerous. People did drown working on the marshes. But communities like this really held together. There was a pride in their work and a deep knowledge of the land and the seasons that was passed down through generations. My favourite part of the cottage was the pantry. The Broads Authority still place potatoes grown here in the pantry, along with lots of bottled and jarred food staples. This type of preservation would have been vital over the winter months, and I really love to see a well-stocked pantry with lots of delicious-looking jarred foods. The cottage stands right by the River Ant, and this would have been a vital transport link. A transport route for reeds, peat, and of course, people. Marshmen often worked for local landowners or in the drainage boards, but they also did seasonal work. So they do reed cutting in winter, mowing and raking in the summer, And it was all hands on deck, and often other members of the family would have pitched in together to make it work. The lovely name Toad Hole Cottage comes from the abundance of toads in the area. In the marshes, toads, frogs and insects were everywhere and part of the environment, and I guess you just lived with it. I like to think of a toad hopping through the back door into the cottage to say hello. Toad Hole Cottage is now looked after by the Broads Authority, and it's been turned into a small museum. It does a really brilliant job of showing not just the physical conditions that the people lived in, but the values and resilience of the community that held the Broads together. Just up the hill from Toad Hole Cottage is How Hill House. It was built in the early 1900s by Edward Boardman, whose family were well-known local architects. Now, I couldn't film this house, unfortunately, because it's an education centre providing holidays for children still to this day. But in 1918, How Hall became the family home for the Boardmans. By now, this tiny cottage had been abandoned, and they turned it into a playhouse for the family children. It must have been like a full-size doll's house for them in which they could explore and play. Quite a comparison to the original use of the building, but still lovely nevertheless. The children who played here grew and they moved away, and the little Toad Hole Cottage was left abandoned until the 1980s, when the Broads Authority saw the importance of this little house and restored it to show the life of a marshman in the 1880s. I just thought it was such a magical little place, and I had to show it to you. And of course, while I was there, it reminded me that the Broads were and still are a working landscape. They weren't shaped by nature, but by generations of people whose lives were tied to the land and the water. People like the Marshmen who lived here quietly kept things going in all weathers. Visiting Toad Hole Cottage gives you a chance to step briefly into the world of a marshman, and it's a brilliant way to understand, again, how much our lives have changed, like we see in lots of my videos. And as always, how much we owe to those who came before us. After visiting the cottage, we took a long walk across the flat fields and came across St.Benets Abbey peeking across the fields. St.Benets is the remain of the only monastic site in England that was not officially closed down by Henry VIII. St.Benets Abbey dates back to the 9th century, but after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1500s, although this monastery was not closed down officially, the number of monks slowly fell and the abbey fell into disrepair. By the 18th century, it was largely a ruin. And in the second half of the 1700s, a local farmer built a windmill inside the abbey ruins. This structure is much of what remains to this day, but it gives the abbey its unique appearance, and I loved to see the small amounts of graffiti on the walls where people have visited here and enjoyed the peace. I thought how crazy it was to build a windmill on top of a site of such historical importance. But I'm glad he did. It just looks so atmospheric. And as you might be able to hear from my film, it sure is windy. Walking around this site was magical. There wasn't a soul around, and I could take in how absolutely huge this site would have once been. It's 38 acres of land, and there would have been up to 40 monks here, along with lay brothers, labourers and servants. There was the abbey itself, a hospitalry, kitchens, fish ponds, and where the high altar once stood, a wooden peace cross was placed here by Elizabeth II. And it's made from wood by nearby Sandringham Estate, which is still a home to the British royal family today. As always, thank you for watching and of course for your support. If you're on the Norfolk Broads, I highly recommend a stop at Toad Hole Cottage. There isn't much information about it online, but it is open most days between Easter and October. It's free to enter and there's a really cute coffee cart outside for refreshments. It's idyllic there and here at the Abbey, and you know I love Norfolk, and this made the trip even more special. If you're still watching, can I ask you a favour? I'm trying to reach more people to share my love of history, and it really helps if you can subscribe to the channel. It's free and I'll never ask you for monetary donations. Simply you showing up to watch and enjoy is enough. Until next Sunday, where I'll be back somewhere else in Norfolk for a really special visit, and I look forward to seeing you there. Goodbye.